For all its beauty and splendor, the wilderness can be a cruel teacher. There is a certain beauty in the backcountry. Out there, beyond the paved loops and crowded overlooks, the land opens into something extraordinary. But the backcountry has teeth. To walk beyond the markers is to strike a bargain with a land that cares nothing for you. In the deep canyons and on the wind-scoured ridges, help sits miles away, days even. A wrong turn among identical ridgelines, a water bottle that empties too quickly, can sharpen into disaster before you realize you're in trouble. Let's venture back to the savage wilderness where survival is earned, not given. This is Outdoor Disasters. For Robert Schock, his North Cascades backcountry run would be catastrophic. The mountains rose like a wall at the end of the road when Robert Schock parked his car at the Hannegan Pass trailhead. The air was already thin with altitude, cool and dry, and the only sound was the steady rush of the Nooksack River below. He wasn't planning to be gone long. On the last day of July 2024, Robert, 39, pulled his car to a stop at the trailhead, stepped out into the thin morning air, and looked east toward the sharp granite ridges of the North Cascades. Behind him, civilization, cell service, asphalt, the comfort of noise, fell away. Ahead lay a labyrinth of forest and stone, where the trails twist like veins and rivers run fast with snowmelt. North Cascades National Park is one of the wildest, steepest, and least developed parks in the United States. A rugged, glacier-carved wilderness tucked in northern Washington near the Canadian border. The park is dominated by jagged peaks, turquoise glacial lakes, roaring rivers, and more glaciers than any other U.S. park outside Alaska. Unlike many national parks, North Cascades has few roads and almost no services once you're inside. Much of the land can only be reached on foot, making it a paradise for experienced backpackers and mountaineers seeking solitude, challenge, and untouched wildness. But that same remoteness comes with real danger. The terrain is unforgiving, the trails strenuous, and rescue resources are limited. Robert tied his shoes, checked the laces twice, and glanced down at his dog Freddie pacing with impatient joy beside the car. He was an ultrarunner, not a backcountry hiker. He didn't carry heavy packs or plan for days in the wilderness. Fishing, camping, bushcraft, none of that was part of who he was. His goal was always simple: start fast, finish strong, and go home. That day in the Cascades, he wore only a pair of running shorts and shoes, no shirt. His small backpack held just the barest essentials: Freddie, his loyal dog, and a collapsible water pan. Nothing more. No map beyond memory. It was supposed to be a quick run along the Chilliwack River Trail, maybe out toward Copper Ridge, then back before dusk. The first miles came easy. The air smelled of wet cedar, and sunlight filtered through fir needles like gold dust. Freddie darted in and out of the brush, splashing through puddles left by the previous night's rain. Schock's stride lengthened, breathing steady, heart in rhythm with the hum of the forest. He passed a young couple coming down the trail who saw him around midday. Bare-chested, moving fast, sweat darkening his hair. They waved and he waved back. Beyond that point, the trail narrowed. Sections were overgrown where fallen trees had blocked maintenance crews. The map in his mind grew uncertain. At a river crossing, he paused long enough to drink and tie a strip of pink surveyor's ribbon around a low branch, his way of marking the route back. Then he pressed on, chasing distance and the clean, punishing solitude he loved. By late afternoon, the weather shifted. The Cascades are notorious for it. A blue sky can curdle to gray in minutes. Wind pushed through the valley, scattering needles and ash-colored dust. Freddie's ears flattened. Schock looked up at the sky, then back at the dimming trail. He considered turning around, but the ridge looked close, and runners are always chasing one more mile. Rain began before he reached it, thin at first, then sudden and cold. Within minutes, the trail had turned to slick mud. His shoes lost traction, his breath came shorter. When he stopped to check his bearings, the forest closed in tight, a tangle of green walls. The ribbons he'd left were nowhere in sight. He tried his phone. No service. We'll just backtrack. Easy, he muttered to Freddie. But the light was already failing. He moved downhill, thinking he was retracing his path. The descent grew steeper, the noise of the river louder. Trees blurred together. When darkness fell fully, there was no trail, just wet soil, and the sound of running water somewhere below. He found a cluster of cedar trunks and ducked beneath them. Freddie pressed close, trembling. Schock had no dry clothes, no food left for himself. He drank sparingly, saving the rest for his dog. The rain kept falling, tapping through the leaves like endless fingers. He told himself it was fine. In the morning, he'd find the path. He'd run hundreds of miles before. He knew his limits. But the Cascades have their own logic. And that night, while he shivered under the dripping trees, the wilderness began to erase the line between the known and the lost. When dawn came, the sky was milk-white and silent. Steam lifted off the ground like breath. Schock stood, stretched the stiffness from his legs, and looked around. Every direction looked the same. Freddie watched him expectantly, tail low. "Let's move," he said at last. He took a step into the green maze and the forest swallowed him whole. At first, he tried to reason his way out. He retraced his steps, searching for the pink surveyor's ribbons he had tied to mark the trail. But the storm that first night had erased them. The wind tore down branches, rain had flooded the low ground, carrying away his tracks. By the second day, every ridge looked identical, every sound unfamiliar. He moved constantly, downhill toward what he thought was the Chilliwack River, convinced that water meant safety, that civilization must exist somewhere downstream. Freddie followed close, sometimes leading ahead, always circling back. Together they drank from the river and rested beneath dripping trees. When hunger began, it came softly, like an ache he could ignore. But after several days without food, the ache turned sharp, crawling up into his ribs and skull. He found berries, small and bitter, and ate them handful by handful. Later he discovered a single mushroom growing from a log, large, fleshy, and unfamiliar. He hesitated, then ate it anyway. It didn't make him sick, and in that moment, it felt like a miracle. Robert believed in those first naive hours that things would sort themselves out, that he'd stumble onto the trail, or rescuers would appear as surely as day follows night. Soon even his dog, the one constant comfort in that vast wilderness, would vanish into the timber, leaving Robert utterly alone. No companionship, no protection. Just a man pitted against one of the most unforgiving backcountries in North America. What was unfolding was the opening chapter of an ordeal that would stretch far beyond anything he'd imagined, an ordeal that would claw at the very edges of human endurance. A week later, when hikers spotted Freddie wandering alone along the Chilliwack River Trail, they thought little of it. But when the dog refused to leave the area, circling the same stretch of riverbank, whining, glancing into the trees, something about it felt wrong. They brought him to rangers, who scanned his microchip and traced him back to a man from Ohio. By August 3rd, Schock's car was found at the Hannegan Pass trailhead, parked just as he had left it days earlier. The windows were rolled down, his wallet on the dashboard. There was no sign of foul play, no note, no gear, only the stillness of an empty vehicle at the edge of the wilderness. When the Whatcom County Humane Society called Schock's mother, Jan Thompson, on August 4th, she hadn't even known her son was in Washington. The next morning, she filed a missing person report with the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office. Within hours, park rangers and deputies launched a coordinated search. Helicopters swept the valleys, and ground teams moved out along every possible trail radiating from the car's location: Easy Ridge, Copper Ridge, and Chilliwack Basin. They found nothing. Each day the grid expanded, the terrain growing crueler. Searchers waded through waist-deep streams, climbed slick ridges, and camped in cold rain. Helicopter crews used thermal imaging, but the dense canopy made visibility nearly impossible. Still, they kept looking. By the second week, the search had turned exhaustive. Dozens of personnel, trained dogs, even U.S. Border Patrol helicopters sweeping the Canadian line. But the Cascades gave back no answers. Jan called every day for updates. Every call ended the same way. No sign yet. She refused to give up. After 2 weeks, with no new leads, the official search began to scale back. Crews had covered miles of wilderness, but without evidence, no clothing, no gear, not even a footprint. Continuing meant risking more lives. Privately, some rescuers believed the odds of survival were almost zero, but Jan held to hope. She called his phone every morning, even knowing there'd be no answer. She replayed the facts: his car, his dog, his routine trail runs. None of it suggested he'd walked away from life. Somewhere in those mountains, she believed, her son was still fighting. And he was, barely. While search teams marked the end of their final grid, Robert Schock lay deep in the Chilliwack Basin, starving, injured, and fading. He'd survived more than 3 weeks on river water, wild berries, and one large mushroom, crawling at times on his hands and knees toward the sound of rushing water. Each night, he shouted for help into the dark, voice breaking, uncertain if anyone could still hear him. The forest had swallowed him whole. For 30 days, Robert Schock wandered the backcountry of the North Cascades, fighting hunger, disorientation, and the steady pull of exhaustion that wanted to lay him down and keep him there forever. He had entered the wilderness as an ultrarunner, fast, disciplined, and lean. What he became was something more primitive, driven solely by instinct. He rationed his energy, resting more, moving only when the cold forced him to. His muscles began to hollow. His shoes tore open at the seams, then washed away when he slipped while crossing the river. After that, he went barefoot, the bottoms of his feet bleeding and raw. Days blurred together. He built small beds of moss, tried to stay dry, and failed. Rain came often, sharp, needling, relentless. At night, he dreamt of home, the hum of a refrigerator, the voice of his mother, Freddie's nails clicking on hardwood floors. Sometimes he woke crying, his throat too dry to make a sound. Freddie had stayed close for the first week, until one morning he wasn't there. Robert called his name until his voice broke. Hours later, he thought he heard a distant bark, but couldn't tell if it was memory or echo. Now alone, Robert moved slower. His mind began to wander between clarity and hallucination. He imagined he heard voices, searchers shouting his name, but when he called back, only the river answered. The Chilliwack Basin was both his salvation and his prison. The river gave him water, but hemmed him in between cliffs and thick brush. The banks were slick with moss, impossible to climb. One day, trying to cross to a gravel bar, he fell. The current caught him and threw him against a boulder. He surfaced coughing, one leg screaming with pain. It wasn't broken, but it left him crippled. He dragged himself onto the rocks, gasping. That was where he stayed, for days, maybe weeks. He couldn't walk anymore. He couldn't even crawl far. He gathered what he could within arm's reach, a few berries, a damp piece of bark for shade, and waited. Each morning he shouted weakly for help, voice barely carrying over the water. By nightfall he stopped. By the 4th week, he'd lost nearly 50 pounds. His vision blurred. His skin had turned gray and paper thin. He prayed for the sound of a helicopter, a voice, anything human. By the end of August, the North Cascades were quiet again. The helicopters were gone. The official search had long been called off. The maps folded away. To the world, Robert Schock was another name on a growing list of those lost to the wilderness. A man claimed by the backcountry, one more ghost in a park that knew too many of them. The day began in late August as every day before it. Robert, stranded and alone in the brutal wilderness of the North Cascades, where survival had become a daily negotiation with fate, he could feel the margin shrinking. Help wasn't just late, it was vanishing. And he knew that if it didn't find him soon, the park would claim him. And then, one afternoon, when he was certain the world had forgotten him, he heard something, faint, rhythmic, almost lost under the roar of the river. Footsteps, metal tools clinking, voices. At first, he thought it was another hallucination, but the voices grew louder. He used what strength he had left to push air from his lungs and shouted the only word he could manage. "Help!" It came out like a whisper, weak, broken, but it was enough. On August 30th, 2024, a Pacific Northwest Trail Association maintenance crew was hiking out after a 10-hour day of clearing brush and repairing the trail along the Chilliwack River. As they trudged down the narrow trail, the sky hung low and gray, the air heavy with the scent of cedar and river mist. Then, from somewhere across the water, one of them thought they heard something, a voice, faint, almost lost under the roar of the current. They stopped, listened. Nothing. The team leader shook his head. Probably the river, he thought. But then they heard it again. A human sound. A word stretched thin by distance. Help! For a moment, no one moved. Then instinct took over. The crew dropped their packs and ran toward the noise, crashing through the underbrush and slippery stones. Across the river, on a gravel bar half buried in alder and driftwood, they found him. At first, they didn't believe he was alive. Robert Schock lay sprawled against the stones, barefoot, skeletal, and soaked to the bone. His skin was pale and blistered, his beard tangled with dirt. He was covered in scrapes, insect bites, and sunburn. His legs were swollen from infection, his lips cracked and bleeding. But when one of the crew knelt beside him, Robert's eyes flickered open. He whispered something, words the crew could barely make out, and they realized with shock that this was the man they'd seen posted on missing person bulletins nearly a month earlier. Robert had survived 30 days in the wilderness with nothing but water, berries, and willpower. He told them haltingly that he hadn't eaten in days, that he'd been immobile for nearly 2 weeks, too weak to crawl any farther, that he'd shouted for help every morning and every night until his voice was almost gone. The crew sprang into action. One gave him the shirt off his back to warm him. Another took out a tortilla and a smear of peanut butter from his pack, the first food Robert had tasted in weeks. They fed it to him slowly, in small bites, afraid his body wouldn't handle more. Then they used their satellite device to call for help. Within the hour, the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office and North Cascades National Park had scrambled a helicopter crew. The pilot hovered above the narrow riverbank while rescuers rappelled down to reach the site. The wind from the rotors whipped sand and pine needles into a frenzy as medics stabilized Robert, checking his vitals and wrapping him in blankets. His pulse was weak but steady. One rescuer later said it was a miracle he was even conscious. When they lifted him from the gravel bar, the crew that had found him stood watching from below, stunned and silent. They'd been in the right place at the only moment that mattered. Another day, in even another few hours, and Robert might not have survived. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying him away from the river that had nearly claimed his life, one of the trail workers broke down crying. They all did eventually. The PNTA's executive director, Jeff Kish, would later call the event improbable and heroic. They saved his life against impossible odds, and it took a toll. Those kids saw something they'll never forget, Kish recalled. When Robert woke in a hospital bed in Cedro Woolley, the room was white and humming with machines. For a while, he didn't understand where he was. Then a nurse told him how long he'd been missing, a whole month, and he wept. He'd lost nearly 50 pounds. His body was in shock, his organs strained, but he was alive. His mother, Jan, flew in from Ohio within days. When she saw him, she didn't recognize him at first, but when he smiled, weak, half asleep, whispering "Mom," she said it was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. Robert later called the trail crew his angels. He said he could barely lift his head when they found him, that he thought he was hallucinating at first. "I thought they were forest spirits. Then I realized I was being saved," he recalled. In the days that followed, details of the rescue spread across the Pacific Northwest. News outlets called it a miracle in the mountains. The Pacific Northwest Trail Association posted a statement praising the young trail workers who had heard Schock's faint cry and found him at the last possible moment. Recovery was slow. His body had burned through almost all its fat and muscle. He could barely lift a spoon. For days, doctors fed him intravenously, careful not to overwhelm his system. He described the hunger as something beyond pain, like being hollowed out from the inside. Robert asked to speak to his rescuers once he was strong enough. The crew visited the hospital a week later. He thanked them, voice hoarse but steady. "You found me at the end. You were the last thing I ever expected to see," he said. One of the young women who'd first heard his cry started crying. Robert, still pale and frail, reached out and said quietly, "You saved me. Don't ever forget that." Over the following weeks, he began regaining weight, 40 pounds by the end of September. His leg injury healed without surgery, though the tendons and joints remained stiff. He told friends he could feel every rock and every mile still inside him. When he was finally discharged, his parents rented a car and drove him home to Ohio, Freddie waiting at the other end. When Robert returned home, Freddie ran to him, whining and pawing at his chest, tail whipping in wild circles. Robert fell to his knees, crying into the dog's fur. "You made it," he said softly. "We both did." For all his suffering, Robert considered Freddie the reason he'd survived as long as he did. "When I was lost, he kept me moving. I didn't want to die while he was watching," he said. When asked if he'd ever return to the North Cascades, he gave a small, tired smile. "Not anytime soon. That mountain and we've said what we needed to say." Getting lost out there isn't always a dramatic mistake. Sometimes it's just one wrong turn, one missed landmark, 1 hour of stubbornness before you realize the world around you is bigger, harsher, and older than anything you've ever faced. But those same moments of fear can turn into the greatest teachers you'll ever have. Carry a map and compass, and know how to use them. Don't trust your phone to save you. Batteries die, signals vanish, and electronics fail. Tell someone where you're going and when you're coming back. Bring more water than you think you need, more layers than seem reasonable, and the humility to turn back when the mountains whisper that you should. If you do find yourself lost, don't panic. Stop, breathe, think. Retrace only if you're certain. Conserve energy. Seek shelter before dark, water before food, warmth before pride. Survival isn't about heroics, it's about discipline. It's about choosing the small, smart decisions that keep you alive long enough for rescue to find you, or for you to find your way home. And yet, for all the danger, the backcountry still calls to us. Because out there, stripped of distractions and comforts, you discover what's left. The raw edge of who you are and what you're capable of. The wilderness can break you, but it can also show you your strength, your courage, and your place in a world far greater than your own. Respect the land, prepare for the worst, hope for the best, and never lose sight of this truth. The beauty and splendor of the wilderness are worth every ounce of risk of an outdoor disaster. If you've made it this far, please consider clicking those subscribe and like buttons. Want more outdoor disasters content? Check out these videos I believe you'll enjoy. Thank you for watching.